Next on the Capitol Cable, tariffs, economic policy, critical technology cooperation, all of that and much, much more. Wendy Cutler, Dr. Philip Luck, Victor Chaw, bringing this all to you next on the Capitol Cable. All right, good morning to those of you in Washington, D.C. Good evening to those of you in the Republic of Korea. Good day to those of you around the world. Welcome to the 117th installment of the CSIS Capitol Cable. I'm Mark Lippert, your host and moderator. As the CSIS Capitol Cable marches on this week on the Capitol Cable, tariffs, economic policy, cooperation in critical technologies, all of that and more. And with us to discuss this, two of our favorite friends here on the Capitol Cable, Wendy Cutler and, of course, Dr. Philip Luck, who are longtime regulars, friends of the show, whatever you want to call it, honorary Capitol Cable, compatriots. They are here. They are loaded for bear. We're going to have a great episode. Let me formally and briefly introduce them because A, we know them already, and B, their bios are online. Look them up. They're unbelievably impressive. And I'm going to go to Wendy Cutler, of course. Wendy, longtime USTR hand, senior official, and intimately involved with the Republic of Korea, including several high-stakes trade negotiations. And now, of course, having transitioned outside of government, Wendy is the vice president of the Asia Society Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C. Wendy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, outstanding. I should also say, you were a frequent visitor to the ambassador's residence when I was there in Korea. I think you had, the key to the liquor cabinet. You were there so often, so it's all good. All right, outstanding.
I was always on my best behavior, though.
That's right. Excellent. Victor, not so much. Anyway, all right. Let's go, of course, to our CSIS colleague, Dr. Philip Luck, who runs the CSIS economics program and the Scholl Chair for International Business. He, of course, is probably best known for his time in government. His best known time in government is as the Deputy Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of State. And of course, he's an expert on economics, international trade, global supply chains. And if you don't get him on one of the CSIS podcasts that he frequently appears on, you are missing out. Dr. Luck, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
All right, outstanding. And last, of course, not least, but we have the venerable Victor Chaw, who runs the CSIS geopolitics program for this great institution. Victor, of course, Vice Dean Emeritus at Georgetown University, an accomplished professor there as well, Defense Policy Board under the Biden administration, NSC under Bush. Victor, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be with you.
All right, outstanding. And let me just tell you, I have cataloged your misbehavior at the Habib house over the years. So that's going to go up online after the show. So outstanding. All right, let's get into a deadly serious topic and really interesting topic, because lost almost in Iran, lost almost in Ukraine is this issue that, you rewind the tape a few months ago, is of paramount importance, right? And continues to be an incredibly salient issue, but we wanted to resurface it here on this episode of the Capitol Cable because of its import to the Korean Peninsula and, frankly, the region in the world. And so with us, let's just dive in to Wendy. And Wendy, just bring us up to speed a little bit on what's going on here with the Liberation Day tariffs, right? You've got, obviously, I saw your post online about Indonesia. You've had some activity in Southeast Asia, critically important markets, partners for Korea. But then, of course, you've got Korea itself as well, and Japan, a country as well. So, Wendy, just give us the laydown on the latest on the Liberation Day tariffs. Thanks.
Well, sure. So just in short, we're now facing an August 1 deadline. So it gives our trading partners just about 2 weeks to try and finalize deals with the United States. So far, counting now Indonesia as well, that deal was announced yesterday, but again, no text, no details. But 3 deals have been concluded with the UK, Vietnam now, and Indonesia, as well as what I would call a tariff truce with China. I don't really view that as one of these trade deals, but that can be debated. Notably, Korea is not part of this list. However, Korea, like other countries, is involved in intensive negotiations with the United States. It got off to a late start due to its change in government, but its officials, under the leadership of its new trade ministers, really hitting the ground running and trying as hard as they can to reach a deal with the United States by August 1. And I would maybe just conclude and just say the stakes for Korea here are enormous. Korea is an export powerhouse. It relies on access to the U.S. market for many of its key products. And it's also an important export destination for many U.S. companies and U.S. farmers. And so, look, I think a deal is possible, but anything can happen between now and the end of this month.
Okay, and Wendy, I don't want to take too big of a detour into this, but I think it's an important clarification point that you've spoken about before. We do have this small thing called the Chorus FTA, right? That is intact, still in force. In last go around, there was a lot of talk about renegotiating that, right? In Trump 1.0. Trump 2.0, we seem to be, I don't know, driving past it in a way. I don't know what the right verbiage here. Can you explain to us the relationship between the ongoing negotiations and the FTA?
You're absolutely right, Mark. No one's talking about renegotiating the FTA. In fact, no one's even talking about the fact we have an FTA in place this time around. And what really strikes me, and this is not just Korea, but I was on earlier this week at conversations with some former senior officials from Peru, another FTA partner. And I've heard this from Australia and Singapore as well, that our FTA partners, frankly, are being disadvantaged through this current negotiating process, in that Korea, for example, already has virtually zero tariffs with the United States. And so unlike a Vietnam or an Indonesia or an India that can lower its high tariffs and make that part of the package for Trump this time around, our FTA partners don't have that tool. So I think in my view, they should be prioritized, and their status should be appreciated, and they should be given some kind of special and preferential treatment. However, I think it's working against them this time around.
All right, outstanding. Let me have one last follow-up question to you on Korea, then I'm going to come to Dr. Luck with a bit of a broader question. So what is the Trump administration after in terms of the relationship with Korea on the economic and commercial side? Obviously, the deficit looms large, right? That's a chronic issue, but there are other issues presumably at play here, number one. And number two, where does this fit into the discussion about sensitive technologies, critical technologies, investment in the U.S. that the Koreans hitherto were, I think, riding that wave of investment into the U.S. to, I would say, greater economic, commercial, and ultimately political ties with the United States?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so look, in these talks, we're seeking a number of things from Korea and others, again, including tariff elimination, but, again, not relevant for Korea, but also relaxation and elimination of non-tariff measures. I think for Korea in particular, this is extremely important. And my sense is if they can show some real concrete progress on dealing with some of these non-tariff measures, particularly in the digital space, that they would get, credit from Trump here. I think that is a priority. Also, the economic security part of these negotiations, including aligning more closely on export controls, screening investments, and reducing Chinese content in exports to the United States. All of those areas are on the table and seem to be a priority for the administration. I think one of them, and these are going to be tough issues for the US and Korea to navigate, given Korea's close integration with China. However, there is a good basis for close work between our two countries there. I would just conclude and say I think the major sticking points are going to be the existing and prospective Section 232 sectoral tariffs. So Korea, major exporter of steel and autos, absolutely needs some relief from those existing tariffs and is pushing hard for that. But also, when you look at tariffs that could pop out at any moment from the ongoing Section 232 investigations, for example, on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, that's also going to have a huge impact on Korea. And the big question is whether the administration is willing to negotiate any special treatment with respect to the Section 232 tariffs. And to date, we've seen, like with respect to autos and Japan, that has been the major sticking point, and those negotiations are not proceeding, given that we're at a bit of an impasse with Japan on that issue, which suggests to me that it's going to be tough sledding for Korea as well.
All right, outstanding. Thanks for the excellent intervention here, Wendy. Let me go to Dr. Luck. Dr. Luck, I'm going to start peppering you with questions here. First, anything to add, I think, just on the lay down the overview of where we are, where we're headed on these Liberation Day tariffs. Let's just start broad strokes, and then I want to get into kind of the regional picture.
Yeah, no, I mean, basic thing is I'm in violent agreement with Wendy, as usual. I would say just a few things that add a little bit of color there. One, I would say I completely agree on the non-tariff barriers. That's something where, again, because we have a free trade agreement, there's much less to sort of negotiate on the actual tariff rates, because they have yet to retaliate to our tariffs. In some sense, the idea would be if you had retaliated, at least you'd have something to come down from. But, that's not where we are. On the non-tariff barriers, I agree, and I agree especially in the digital space. There's places to move there. But that takes time. I mean, the problem is tariffs, you can agree, okay, we're going to reduce our tariffs from 2% to 1%, done. Non-tariff barriers often requires changes to domestic legislation. If it's something to do with agriculture, there's even more time. These are long issues. So this is why things like free trade agreements take a long time to negotiate. So, the idea that we do this over a few weeks is kind of comical. So that's one thing I would say. I'd also foot stomp on Wendy's point about the integration with the Chinese economy. Look, Korea is one of the openest economies in the world. They have enormous integration with most of the developed large economies. And also their economy, their firms trade in other markets as well. So they're really exposed here. And as they're very close to the PRC and they have, tense relationships with the PRC. So it's going to be difficult for them to sort of, de-risk in certain ways that we may want to push them harder. So I would say absolutely. And the last thing I would say, to your question about what's the point of all this? Look, I can give you sort of academic reasons for why these tariffs would be used, whether it's revenue or industrial policy. I think sometimes we over-intellectualize this. I think the goal of these tariffs is tariffs. And I think that's the problem here, where, to Wendy's point, our partners are not really sure how to negotiate because they're not really sure what the objective is. And sometimes it seems like more and more the objective is to have tariffs. So if that's the objective, then what are we negotiating over?
It's a fair point. I mean, let me just make one comment, see if you agree. It's almost there's almost an endless leverage taking element of this negotiation, right? In a way, you could cast it in the form of tariffs, but in the case of Korea or other nations, you see other elements being brought into it, almost just for leverage sake, right? In terms of running the relationship. Okay, so my comment aside, so let's talk a little bit about the region, right? You've got Korean companies who are very invested in India, very invested in Vietnam. We'll get to Mexico in a second. You also, to your point about regional integration, the Koreans look to Japan. Wendy mentioned that as well. Talk to us a little bit about Asia writ large in this discussion with the Trump administration and what clues and where we are in terms of that state of play.
So I would say, I mean, the first thing I would say there is, and I think, we have a challenge here where we have sort of, obviously we're using sort of what you might call beggar thy neighbor policies, but now we all have all of our neighbors trying to make sure that they're at least the most favored neighbor. And so that's a problem because, everybody, obviously nobody wants tariffs imposed on them, but the last thing they want is a higher tariff on them than their sort of close competitors. And so, you might imagine a world where, in the early days after Liberation Day, there was all this talk about sort of people like coordinating and teaming up and sort of providing a united front. That hasn't happened. And, there's a lot of very good reasons why that hasn't happened. And I think the problem is everyone's trying to make sure, they do okay. I think a lot of our partners, especially in Asia, were, excited to see the UK deal especially because it had that auto carve out, but they were also worried because they don't have a deal yet and they weren't there yet, and so that's a concern. The last thing I would say too on that point is, again, Korea is this sort of a unique position where not only are they affected by our tariffs on third markets, so whether it's their firms producing in Vietnam or other countries, they're also affected by retaliation against the United States by our other partners, right? So in the height of the sort of China-US sort of back and forth, they were getting it from all sides because they were having to import semiconductor manufacturing equipment from the United States and then shipping it to their factories in the PRC and getting charged PRC tariffs, right? So because they're so exposed, both in their bilateral trade with other partners, but also the global footprint of their firms, they are in some ways a uniquely poor position.
And so this begs the question, and I'll to you, Dr. Luck, and then over to Dr. Cha. What is the Korean strategy here that you've seen going forward to try to deal with some of these adverse impacts on their trading and economic policies?
It's a great question. I will defer largely to Wendy and Victor on this. I would say I agree completely with Wendy that one of the major sticking points has been these 232 tariffs, specifically the autos and steel and aluminum. So just, for your listeners who are a little bit less of trade nerds than, honestly, hopefully most of your audience, no one should know these things. But 232 tariffs are tariffs for national security grounds, and those are essentially administered by Commerce BIS, as opposed to tariffs 301, which is the USTR. In this administration, basically you can't talk to there's not one person in charge of these tariffs. So if you want to talk about the 301, you're talking to USTR. If you want to talk about 232, you're talking to Commerce. And regardless of who you're talking to, you're not going to get a straight answer about what they need or what they want to get a deal done, because that's all got to go to the president. So I think many of our partners are just struggling with how to navigate this multi-headed administration. But again, because there's been very little openness to movement on these 232 auto tariffs, especially for big auto exporters like Japan and South Korea. I mean, yeah, we got to deal with the UK, but okay, we're importing a few more Land Rovers. Like, I think the auto workers in the United States are going to be okay with that. I think that's a main sticking point right now. I don't really know what their strategy is of that, though.
Gotcha. Outstanding. All right. And I'm going to come back to you later on Europe, because I do want to get to Europe. You brought in the UK. That's a very interesting example. Victor, over to you. Obviously, anything you want to comment on in terms of the previous intervention, but also I want to get to the point of the Korean strategy. We just had the National Security Advisor, a good friend of this show who's been on before, Sung-lac in town. Obviously, Han Koo-yeo's been in and out of town, probably visiting with Wendy as well. They're old friends. But Victor, the Korean strategy on this really important bucket of issues for their economy and commercial relationships.
Thanks, Mark. Well, excellent comments by both Phil and Wendy. I mean, I think this point about how countries like Korea and Japan actually chose a different path when after Liberation Day than, let's say, Canada, the EU, and China. They didn't retaliate, right? They wanted to make a deal, and because of that, they never raised their tariffs. to negotiate them down. They're at zero. So, it's like Wendy said, their companies were globalized. They had free trade agreements, all these things that made them good allies are working against them now, and that's really kind of unfortunate. On the Korean strategy, Wendy can speak to this better, but my understanding is that, um, the answer to this is not going to be like, promising more on non-tariff barriers. It's got to be a much bigger deal. And at least the news reports we're getting say that they're talking about other things like shipbuilding and strategic energy cooperation, foreign direct investment, even perhaps on the defense side, burden sharing, trying to make enlarge the problem, if you will, to try to get sort of a big deal. I think when National Security Advisor Wee came, I think he came with some ideas about foreign direct investment, but that clearly was not enough, right? That was not enough for Rubio or for him to get in to see the president. So they're going to have to try to go back to the drawing board. I know, again, Wendy knows the trade minister, and try to figure out what kind of deal they can put together. That's one problem. And of course, because it goes beyond simply the trade lane, right? It goes beyond non-tariff barriers or tariffs. This is a huge interagency coordination issue on the South Korean side, right? They have to get all their ducks in a row. But then the other part of that is they can get all their ducks in a row, but then how do they get the message to Trump? As Phil was saying, like, they can talk to Lutnick, they can talk to Bessent, they can talk to Greer, but in the end, all of those people are not entirely certain they're going to transfer what they're hearing to the president, because they don't have the authority to negotiate that. So that makes the leader meeting extremely important, right? The two leaders have to meet because, Trump was on the phone with Prabowo, right? He announces a deal. They have to be able to meet, and they, as we know, they didn't meet in Canada. They didn't meet at The Hague. So, that's really, really important. And there was some talk about, President Lee coming here in this month. I don't know the status of that after the Rubio meeting. And of course, there's APEC in October if the president goes to APEC in October. But that's a long way from now, and they need something more quickly than that. As Wendy said, they're 6 months behind everybody else because of the political crisis in Korea.
All right, and Victor, what would you say in terms of next steps are we likely to see from the Korean government? Because to your point, we've had the high-level envoys here. We've had Lee Jae-myung proximate to the president at multilateral summits. That's come and gone. We don't have a meeting scheduled yet between the two leaders. What's likely going to be the catalyst for some of this action? Or are we going to just see negotiations, continue on, 232 processes continue on, and tariffs ultimately implemented on a Korean economy that's already, you would say, I don't want to use the term shaky, but I guess weighted down by some of the global headwinds.
Yeah, I mean, as we've talked about before, the economy is, it's in big trouble right now. I mean, exports, Wendy can speak to this. Last I saw, 8% down to the U.S. last quarter, year on year. They cut the growth rate. Bank of Korea cut the growth rate in half, right? Auto exports are down. This is like not a good situation for Korea. It's not a good situation for Lee either politically, because he has no honeymoon. And again, as we've talked about, he's got local elections less than a year from now, which will be seen as a referendum on his first year in office. There's a lot of political pressure too. I think that they certainly cannot wait till APEC for a face-to-face meeting. I mean, my guess on this, and I am just guessing, is that the trade minister is going to work very hard to try to put together some sort of package to tee up a phone call between Trump and Lee before August 1st, so that Trump can announce either a summit meeting where Lee's going to come and negotiate this, or at least another exemption until the two of them meet and let the negotiators like continue to work this, or something along those lines. Trump will not extend the tariff exemptions again without, I think, as somebody said, without showing he has more leverage, right? So he's not going to extend it unless he can say, "Oh, I'm going to go now to 40%," by September, or he's going to say, "I've already got some good things in my pocket that the South Koreans have given. We got to do more. Let's extend, until Labor Day, and let's see what else we can get." Something like that. So I think that they have to, I don't know the logistics of trying to get a meeting in July and August. I don't know how easy that'll be to do, but they're gonna, the trade minister is gonna have to work hard so they can tee up, a substantive phone call like he did with Prabowo to try to make at least the first part of a deal, or like phase one of a deal, or at least some sort of conditional exemption past August 1st.
Okay, outstanding. All right, thanks, Victor. Wendy, to you, you've been mentioned multiple times as someone who would provide answers on these questions. So you're now in the hot seat. They've passed the buck to you. It's like impress your luck. That the old game show. You've got some spins that you have to take now. So the question to you is Koreans' next move, right? What's their plan? What's their strategy? What do you see as kind of the next steps to try to get some traction on at least forestalling some of the more serious tariff or other U.S. trade actions that could be applied to the Korean Peninsula? Wendy, you're on mute. You're on mute.
The clock is not working in Korea's favor right now because their teams need to be spending a lot of time in Washington. But as Victor and Phil alluded to, there's a lot of work they need to do at home. This is a new government. And let's just be honest, it's a government with many different ministries. And even when I negotiated the FTA 20 years ago, at that time, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was leading the negotiation and playing that coordinating role. I think that coordinating role has presented more challenges for MOTI, which is their equivalent of our Commerce Ministry, in that ministries like the Agriculture Ministry and others, they're not just going to do what MOTI wants. And so I think Blue House oversight is really needed here as well if this thing is going to be headed in the right direction. I expect we'll see the trade minister back here, but I would not be surprised also if we see other ministers who, my understanding, like today or yesterday in Korea, we're going to have their National Assembly consultations, so could take office sometime this week. So we may see some of them coming to Washington too. And, that runs a risk as well, because if you have too many channels and too many cooks, then, it just is harder to corral everything together. I still do not rule out a deal by August 1 with Korea, because let's keep in mind, these deals are framework deals. And for the most part, if some kind of tariff rate's agreed upon, and if there's some down payment with elimination of non-tariff measures and discussions to continue on other non-tariff measures, and this is, elements of shipbuilding cooperation, semiconductor cooperation, more FDI or purchases, you can see this coming together. Again, I think it's like a very heavy lift given the clock, but I don't rule it out. The other point I would just make, and I totally agree with Victor from a relationship point of view, there's nothing more important for Korea right now for its new president to meet with our president. But in my little trade world, these discussions between the two leaders, if they're talking about closing a deal, I can't emphasize how important proper preparation is. Because if you get on the phone with our president, he may make new demands. And if your leader is not fully briefed or willing to push back, then you may end up with a deal that is even more counterproductive to your national interest. So my counsel, not only for Korea, but for any now foreign government, just make sure that if there is a leader-to-leader call, that, proper preparation becomes a priority. And I personally think that impacted kind of developments on Vietnam and where we are right now, where a quote unquote deal was announced like 2 weeks ago. And from everything I hear, the details are still being negotiated, including perhaps, at least from Vietnam's perspective, the tariff rates.
Well, and to your point, Wendy, your advice, let me try to add to it. It also feels like leaders can't be overly scripted, right? In terms of thinking that this will be a kind of a coronation or a blessing of the deal kind of phone call. This could be a real negotiation. So you better be prepared to not just read the talking points, but also perhaps engage. And there's a risk to engagement, right? Risk one is you get a bad deal. Risk two, if you're too scripted and you aren't able to engage, you get a hang up by the president on the phone call and no deal, right? So you have to be really
and another
adroit.
risk is, let's just say you push back. And then Trump could get off the phone and say, well, you know what? That 20% tariff wasn't high enough. It's now 40%.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so very interesting stuff. And we've seen some Korean leaders come to Washington and be heavily scripted, right? Or be on the phone with leaders and be heavily scripted. So it's an important caveat there. There was some, I was reading just an interesting blog post, and I'm not endorsing it, but it was an interesting comment. Said, this is where we need Lee Myung-bak, the bulldozer, the big deal maker, the shoot from the hip guy, right? And anyway, so neither here nor there, but it's an interesting dynamic at the leader-to-leader level. And I will say on a serious note, recall when Moon Jae-in tried to engage President Trump at one of the multilateral summits on the SMA, the security, the burden sharing agreement. The offer got, let's put it this way, the demands went up, not down. They went up, not down in that point. So it's a good lesson with applicability to Korea. All right, let me come back to Dr. Luck here. Dr. Luck, obviously anything you want to add to the Korean experience, but the Koreans obviously are watching other deals. You mentioned the UK deal. I want to come back to the Europeans, right, particularly, because it's a trading bloc that the Koreans watch closely. And also the Japanese as well. Those two major trading partners, major allies with the U.S. Can you give us a little context with where things stand with the U.S. and what the Koreans might learn from these two different cases?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say the first thing is I completely agree with Wendy that a deal could happen over the next few weeks, just because these deals, they mean almost nothing in some sense, right? I mean, the only one where we have text of it is the UK, really. And really what we have is basically readouts from both sides, which don't really agree with each other all that much in a lot of places, right? So, these are frameworks for future conversations kind of at best, but I mean, they do have a real impact, which is presumably if you negotiate something down, you get whacked with something slightly smaller. So, that's a real benefit, obviously. So, I don't know how much there is to learn from the UK case. I mean, the UK is a situation where, I mean, look, if we wanted to get a free trade agreement with the UK tomorrow, that would be pretty easy, right? They are about as happy to deal with us as anybody. What we did get is pretty narrow, and what they got, as I sort of alluded to before, in terms of a exemption from the 232 on autos, was easier for us politically, I think, or the administration to give, because we don't import a lot of autos from the UK, and what we do are luxury vehicles. It's Jaguars and Land Rovers, right? This is, to the extent to which we should be, I think we should be thinking about those auto tariffs as an attempt to win over the membership of the UAW, and to the extent to which that's your objective, I don't think that Land Rovers is a problem there. That's not the case for the ROK. That's not the case for Japan. It's also not really the case for the EU. So I don't think so. So far, that does not seem to be on the table. So I'm not sure what they can learn from that, other than, I think, as Wendy mentioned, that the preparation is critically important. The EU, I mean, again, I think this is another challenge where because there's this sort of like multi-headed sort of negotiating framework, and there's a kind of a vacuum of clear guidance from sort of the president about what the priorities are, basically every negotiator is going to say that their priorities are the most important to get over the line, right? So if you talk to USTR, you're going to hear an enormous amount about non-tariff barriers because they're really focused on that, right? If you talk to, others, and you're going to hear different things, right? So, I agree, non-tariff barriers, especially for both the EU on digital markets types issues and for the ROK, are genuine irritants that could, and we could get to a better place. I also don't know that that's going to do much because I just can't imagine the president sort of crowing about a reduction in a non-tariff barrier in digital market access, right? I think what he wants to do is, do what he did for the Indonesia, which is talk about billions of dollars of investments, right? So, I don't know that there's that much there. And I think with the EU, again, the other issue there is, and this is fair, they're a very large market, and they, have until recently really been coming into this from the standpoint of a traditional negotiation, which is we both have, grievances. We would both like lower barriers. You will give something, we will give something, and we'll sort of get somewhere. That is not the way this administration is dealing with this. They are viewing this, as they view many other topics, as purely concessionary, in the sense that we have leverage, and what will you do so that we don't exercise that leverage? And so I don't know where that leaves our partners, but that certainly is, I think the EU is starting to wake up to that as sort of the table stakes.
Can I come in on one follow-up? I know we're a little off topic here, but it's a really interesting one. On the EU point, a bit similar to China in that they have a substantially large market and a lot of throw weight, for lack of a better term. The Chinese exercised said throw weight, and to Wendy's point earlier, got to something of a truce, right? Might you see the EU exercise their leverage? Do they have enough leverage over the United States administration whereby you might be able to get into a different frame than some of these other negotiations that you mentioned?
It's entirely possible. It's a great question, and I think we'll see in some sense, right? I think there was a lot of talk immediately after Liberation Day that the EU was going to, use their anti-coercion instrument, which was created basically under because of the first Trump administration, that to sort of impose tariffs. They had a whole sort of list of things they were going to hit. The very early days, the things I was hearing was, well, we're going to wait because when the U.S. economy sort of nosedives, we don't want it to look like it's our fault, right? I don't know if that's how honest that was, but that's at least what they were saying. I think now they're realizing, look, the way I think of it now is the United States, this administration has shown a willingness to impose pretty significant harm on the U.S. economy. These things will be costly. When your opponent across the table in sort of a negotiation is showing a pretty significant willingness for self-harm, the idea of using a tool to harm them more that's also going to harm you becomes a little bit less attractive. The other issue I would say, and this gets kind of far outside the lane of pure economics, is this administration has really blurred the lines between sort of pure economic into security, whether that's through export controls or talking about sort of defense spending or forward troop deployment. That becomes a really uncomfortable place for the Europeans to be in the current moment. So I don't know if they're going to do that. And again, I would say one other thing really quickly on this is, economists like me have been saying that this is going to be costly to the U.S. economy, and I agree. I think that's true. And in the long run, I'm sure that I will be right, but it has not materialized that quickly yet. Inflation has not really ticked up in the way that we might have expected. Producer price index just came out for the last month, and it's flat. The day before, July 30th, will be second quarter GDP. That's anticipated to be genuinely positive. So, I think this administration might be feeling some amount of, I would consider it earned, but confidence that their strategy might be working, and in which case, I don't know that they're going to be in too much of a deal mode.
Gotcha. Fair point. I guess the counters to that are somewhat well known are, one, we really haven't imposed the tariffs yet, right? So you don't see as much. Two, lots of stockpiling, right? And anyway, so there's some, it's a very interesting question, right? But your confidence point is well taken. All right, we've got a few minutes, just about a minute left. Let me come back to Wendy. Let's go back, Wendy, Philip, and Victor for final thoughts here. Wendy, floor is yours. Closing thoughts here.
So just to build on your question to Phil, I think for Korea, when they look at all the other trade negotiations going on, it's Japan they're really focused on, in that they cannot go home with a worse deal than Japan. And Japan also feels that they cannot go home with a worse deal than Korea. So this dynamic, I think, is going to be very important to watch. And it's very tricky because Japan now has its upper house elections this coming weekend, and is not in an active negotiating mode. So I would just put that on the radar screen, something we haven't discussed. But also, just to emphasize the earlier point, and we didn't talk about Mexico, or Vietnam or India, but again, Korea is such an export powerhouse. I think, like, if you look at just the raw numbers, 75% of trade it's the size of its GDP, right? So trade is just such a critical part of its economy. And so they are not only going to be impacted by these bilateral tariffs, but they're also going to be very impacted by all other tariffs all around the world. So they need to be closely watching all of that. And their companies must be just in pulling their hair out, trying to figure out, where to produce, where to move, how to adjust supply chains. And this is, I think, just leading to kind of more stress and strain in Seoul.
All right, outstanding. And Wendy, you hit all of my unanswered questions or issues that I didn't raise here that I wanted to get in. So thank you for packing it in. I also got overly dazzled by the EU and didn't get to my follow-up question on Japan as well. So well played. Excellent. Dr. Luck, final thoughts from you.
Mainly just, again, violent agreement with Wendy. I think the point that really has to be emphasized is the U.S. we trade a lot. We're a big trader in aggregate terms, but in terms of the trade exposure of our economy relative to GDP, we're a pretty closed economy. That is not true of the ROK. That is not true of many of our trading partners. So there's a lot of incentive to both reduce our bilateral trade barriers, but not succumb to some sort of global raising of tariffs and a sort of tariff war. So there's just a lot of focus on that.
All right, outstanding. And Victor, last word to you.
Okay, 3 quick points. The first is that on the points that have been made about digital, and then also Philip and my colleague Naveen Girishankar has been writing some stuff on the full stack AI that Korea offers. I think these are things that I think these folks would say are very important from a U.S. perspective to be part of, some big trade deal with the United States. Whether that animates Trump is a completely different story, right? Because he's not going to point to that. He just wants to say the tariff number went down from 15% to 0 or something. But I think that's very important. The other is agriculture, which is something that would animate Trump, but politically extremely difficult in Korea, right? And so there, the answer may be enlarge the deal, move into other areas, look at shipbuilding, look at energy, look at even defense burden sharing, because ag may be just too, maybe there's some token thing on ag, but it's difficult. It's going to be very difficult at home. Third point is what you guys were saying about the overall state of the economy. It was only a few months ago that everybody said we were going to be in a recession in the summer, right? Right, and that's clearly not where we are. Mark's points about stockpiling are right, but at the same time, that number that Phil is talking about, that's going to come out at the end of the month, everybody's going to focus on that, and it's not going to be, at least it doesn't look like it's going to be a bad number. So the way that speaks to Korea is that means like a patient strategy, like waiting to see the U.S. economy start to tank, waiting to see pressure build on Trump, waiting for a Japan deal, waiting for the appeals on the International Trade Court, rulings on AIPA, these sorts of things. They can't wait for those things, right? They're not going to wait anyway, but they can't wait for those things. And then the last point is what Wendy said about they're watching the Japan deal. I don't know, Wendy. I don't know how possible it is for Japan and Korea to talk to each other about these sorts of things, to sort of, see what they're both seeing in their negotiations. I don't know if that is a completely um, um, blasphemous thing to say among trade negotiators, but you would think that they're in very similar positions and they've both got a lot at stake, as we've talked about.
All right, outstanding. And just two quick go backs, Victor, on the AIPA point, which is interesting, we didn't service, doesn't really help the Koreans on the 232 actions, right, which are so critical to them, right, number one. And number two, on the defense burden sharing, interestingly enough, the one bit of traction I think Sung-lac got in Washington, or at least according to the Korean press, is UpCon, right? Up on the stage again. Here we go again. All right. Well, look, this was an outstanding episode. I want to just thank the guests. Wendy Cutler, thank you. Philip Luck, thank you. Victor Cha, thank you. Outstanding work. A whirlwind tour de force in about 45 minutes. My brain is full, as the Far Side cartoon once promulgated. So there we go. All right. Outstanding. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see everybody in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks so much.